Good morning. Good morning. Uh, let's take a look at chapter 5. Chapter 5 is on police operational issues. Very interesting chapter, I thought. The text actually starts out talking about the idea, of course, that there a lot of the public's concern for critique and support of the police is going to stem from police operational daily tasks. So tasks that they engage in on a regular basis. So it starts out, of course, talking about police violence. Um, and when we talk about police violence can be acts that are against or by police officers. I know in many instances when we think about police violence, we're thinking about an actual officer being violent against a citizen. However, when we're talking about police violence, it can be both ways. So it can be that an officer engages in a violent offense against, I shouldn't say a violent offense, a violent act against a citizen, or it could be that a citizen engages in a violent act against a police officer. Now, keep this in mind. The police violence can either be justified and sometimes it can be unjustified. It can be legal and it can also be illegal. It can be deadly, and you also have non deadly acts that occur as well. Now, based off of police officers dealing with this police violence, during the course of their work, individuals or police officers often deal with stress. Okay, we talk about stress. We know that stress is going to be the effects of influences upon persons, and this stress and this impact is going to impact the individual physical as well as their emotional functioning. Right, stress can also lead to other health related problems. It can also lead to an individual engaging in alcohol use. It could also be a disruption to one's family life. It could be, you could have issues with your personal psychological your psychological effects. And then the last thing, unfortunately, is we have officers who engage in suicide as a result of dealing with so much stress. Okay, of course, it should be noted, class, that officers who work in less populated areas, they are less susceptible to violence, right? And that could be on both ends. That could be that an officer doesn't have to engage in much violence against citizens, and police officers won't receive so much violence from citizens as well. What is so important, class, is that when an officer is dealing with citizens within the community, they have to make sure that they use the right amount of force, right? The right amount of force that is appropriate for whatever is going on. The use of inappropriate force could result in a number of things happening. One thing is that a suspect could flee. If you're not using enough force, it's just like, okay, that person was able to get away. You also want to make sure that you don't use too much force, right? Because an officer can be held liable, right? If he or she uses what's known as excessive force. And we're going to go into more details about excessive force a little bit later in the chapter. Now, in talking about stress, right? Stress, of course, generally has a negative impact on individuals, right? Whether that person is a police officer or not, they can have very negative impacts. We should also note that not all officers are going to deal with stress. Or deal with the same levels of stress, right? So you might have one officer who has encountered a situation, right? And that officer is not stressed out about it, right? You have another officer who deals with that same situation and it makes that officer very, very stressed out. Okay. So it's just going to depend on the individual as to whether or not an individual is going to be stressed because of various situations, right? Um, your textbook talks about the idea that female officers, they tend to deal with a little bit more stress. Your textbook says that they tend to feel like they have to prove themselves, prove that they can do this job. And the reason why they feel like they have to prove themselves that they can do this job, because we know being a police officer is a male dominated area, right? And so, yeah, they feel like they have to try and keep up with the fellas. They want to prove that they're able to do this particular job. You also have to keep in mind that stress can come just not from things that you actually encounter, but stress can come from things that your colleagues actually encounter. So if I have a colleague who is seriously injured, if I have a colleague who has been shot, for example, right? That can be very, very difficult. I know this person, right? I'm friends with this person. This person is my colleague, right? And so that can make it very, very stressful, but you're also dealing with things that your colleagues encounter as well. Another thing that your textbook talks about is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. We should note that post-traumatic stress disorder can be defined as a psychological encounter to a violent, a psychological reaction to a violent encounter. I'm sorry. So yeah, so basically you have these um feelings, right? You could have feelings of hopelessness that could get an individual where they are dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, right? If an officer is continuously dealing with traumatic offenses, that could lead someone to have suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. In some instances, individuals just think about a situation, a traumatic situation that occurred. That just basically amplifies the effects of that particular incident. And it's more likely that an individual will suffer from post traumatic stress disorder. Now, let me say this. When police officers are dealing with stress, there are two different ways or two different approaches that they can actually take, right? You have what's called the action oriented approach, right? And you also have the avoidance strategy. When you're talking about the action oriented approach, this is when you actually have a problem, but the you make efforts to deal with the stress of that particular problem, right? That means you might go for counseling, you might go for therapy, you might take vacations, you might take some days off, you might get a massage. Whatever it is that's going to help you, you're taking some action to deal with the stress of this particular job, right? And then you have what's known as the avoidance strategy. With the avoidance strategies, this is basically when you do nothing to deal with the stress, right? You're just basically trying to avoid the problem, right? So what begins to happen is it says this particular strategy, of course, is going to be more problematic. And of course, it's going to be the direct opposite of the action oriented approach. And let me say this, most officers tend to avoid the stressful aspects, right? They also seek to engage in negative coping strategies. You have to understand, if you're stressed about anything, whether you're a police officer, whether you are dealing with this situation that we're dealing with right now, COVID-19, whatever it is, you have to find some type of coping mechanism. It's so important, right? And it would be beneficial, of course, to find positive coping strategies, right? However, your textbook talks about the idea that many police officers, they're going to engage in negative coping strategies. So they're going to engage perhaps in smoking, right? They may also have withdrawal from their family and their friends. They could also engage in substance abuse. All of those different things are considered to be negative coping strategies. Now, another impact of stress could be burnout, right? We've all heard the term burnout. Burnout is going to be mental or emotional exhaustion, right? Burnout can come not just from being a police officer. Burnout can come from any job, whether you're a preacher, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a therapist, a social worker, whatever the case may be. You can get mentally and emotionally exhausted, right? And so, based off of these particular things, many police departments have tried to put different things in place for burnout. Remember, we talked about burnout a little bit in our previous chapter. In chapter 4, we talked about how police officers, when they encounter burnout, they're basically trying to avoid any type of responsibility, right? This is when I gave you the example of an officer coming out and Miss Warden and her husband are fighting. They're just like, hey, y'all need to just cut it out, right? They're not trying to write a report. They're not trying to take anybody to jail, right? Because they are burned out. They're just trying to avoid any type of responsibility as it relates to their job, okay? And burnout does occur, okay? We also have to understand that burnout could be disengagement, it says, from the job. Individuals could engage in alcoholism, suicide, and various other responses as coping mechanisms, right, in order to deal with this particular burnout. Now, one thing your textbook starts out talking about is divorce and other family problems as one, right? They talk about the idea that police officers, in many instances, have a lot of domestic violence that occurs within their own household. Unfortunately, because they are police officers, much of it goes unreported, right? It has been noted that police officers are at high risk of engaging in domestic violence. And one of the reasons why they say that an officer is more likely to engage in domestic violence is because they've been taught as officers that if you get into a situation that you're not able to control, then you are going to resort to violence in order to get that situation under control, if that makes sense, right? So, however, it should be noted that this is not going to be suitable for marriage. This is not going to be suitable for family life, right? It's not a matter of I can't control this situation, and so I'm going to beat my spouse. I can't control this situation, and so I'm going to beat my children, right? No. And so you just have to know how to turn the job off when you're a police officer, just as anybody else, right? You have to turn the job off. Once you actually leave the job, leave it at the job, right? Your textbook talks about one act in particular, the Ombudsman Consolidated Appropriations Act of 1997. This particular act has, of course, impacted policing. It mandated that individuals convicted of domestic violence, that they may not be able to possess a firearm, okay, or the use of a firearm. Very, very unfortunate. But if get yourself caught up in domestic violence as a police officer, then you run the risk of actually losing your job. Okay. Your textbook also talks about the idea that there are two general reasons that could be offered as to why police officers have alleged higher rates of divorce. Okay. One, they say, is going to be the stress of the job. The second thing they say is the nature of police work in general, right? And the characteristics of the individuals who actually go into policing. They give some examples, right? They talk about, for example, partnering male officers with female officers could, in fact, result in spouses becoming very uncomfortable. You have to understand, you have a spouse, so you have a partner and you're a police officer, you spend a lot of time with that partner, right? If you work in 10-hour days or 12-hour days, right? You're with, and you have a partner, you're with that person for those 12 hours, 10 hours, whatever the hours are, right? You're usually in very, very confined spaces together, right? You also have to have each other's back, right? And so that's why some spouses tend to get very uncomfortable with the situation. However, it should be noted that some departments have recognized that there is a concern for family, and they have family peer groups, right? So they also have a lot of resources for families in which they can support families. They also have counseling that helps officers deal with the challenges of police work, which I think is very, very good and actually going to be much needed. And then we have things like suicide, right? You have substance abuse, you have health problems, you have things, various issues that are considered to be byproducts of policing. So certain things that could happen as a result of one actually being a police officer, right? So I have a couple of more things I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to get out of your way. Of course, when we talk about suicide, it says among policing, this is the occupation that has one of the highest levels of suicides, right? In comparison to the general public. And of course, suicide is going to be where an officer actually takes his or her life. Okay. They talk about the idea that in many instances, the actual number of police officers, suicide among police officers is going to be underestimated. For example, you have some officers, because there is such a strong bond among police officers, and I think we talked about that in our previous chapters. Officers may encourage a department to misclassify a suicide as a death in order to protect the reputation of the officer. So basically, say this officer, died of natural causes. Say this officer died of whatever, all of these different things, but don't say they died of actual suicide, right? When an officer dies of suicide, it's going to reflect negatively on the department. It also suggests that the department has failed to provide adequate psychological counseling and other types of support for the officers. Let me say this. There are lots of officers who have psychological counseling, therapy, all types of things for officers. However, in many instances, officers don't take advantage of it, right? Because it's kind of like a good old boy system, right? Kind of, we have these macho men and all these different things where, I can deal with it. I'm tough. I'm strong. I don't really need all of that. When in hindsight, they actually do. They're actually hurting on the inside. They're actually dealing with a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder, dealing with family problems as a result of their job, perhaps dealing with issues with their own children. And so that's why they choose to engage in suicide. You also have a lot of officers who engage in substance abuse, right? It says police officers are at higher risk than the general public for not only drug abuse, but also alcoholism, right? They actually use this to alleviate stress, right? They use alcohol and they use drugs basically as a coping mechanism, right? And so that's very unfortunate. They also talk about the idea that stress and related challenges associated with police workplace officers at a higher risk to drink alcohol as a coping method, which subsequently puts officers at higher risk of developing alcoholism. You talk about other health problems, right, that officers can encounter aside from their actual physical police work, right? You have to think about officers can be physically harmed. They could actually be killed. Police officers are more susceptible to experiencing various health problems, which could lead to them having a shorter lifespan. Officers are believed to have higher rates of things like diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, indigestion, liver and colon cancer, right? It says it's unclear if the reasons officers are more likely than the general public to experience health-related problems and death is attributed to high levels of stress or their lifestyles of being a police officer. What we can think about for a moment, though, is the idea that officers could easily fail to eat healthy foods, for an example. Instead, eating regular non-nutritional meals, right? Because they get these discounts sometimes at fast food restaurants. Sometimes they're just eating out because they didn't bring their lunch, right? And it's a job on the go. We talk about indigestion, I think your textbook said, right? Eating very, very quickly, because if you get called out on a call and you're having lunch, hey, you got to move, right? And so all of these things can lead to health problems as it relates to one being a police officer. It also talks about the shifts that they work could cause them, the inconsistency, I should say, in their shifts, the danger that's associated with the job, unhealthy eating habits, various other problems pertaining to police work puts police officers at a higher risk of having various health related problems. Okay. The last thing your textbook talks about is addressing the byproducts of policing, right? So it says, so what can be done to address stress and the related byproducts of policing? One thing they say is provide coping methods so that our officers can properly deal with harmful aspects of being a police officer, right? Second thing they say is identify and address the stressful aspects of actual policing, right? So they say police departments have made various strides to addressing the stressful nature of police work. Now, historically, I have to say there was very little assistance for addressing particular issues, right? So things such as dealing with stress, substance abuse, there was very little that was done. However, we have made some changes across the nation in trying to make sure that officers that we address the harmful byproducts of being a police officer. So offering counseling, psychiatric services, right, are being made available to police officers with personal problems, providing access to alcohol and abuse treatment, as well as counseling family members among the steps that these are some of the things, some of the steps that have been taken among various police departments to address, not only to address, but to also prevent problems as it may pertain to stress. Okay, that's going to conclude this part of chapter 5. I don't want to give you guys too much. I know it's very difficult for you guys to sit down and listen to this, but I want to give you just a little bit of a nugget. I hope and I pray that everyone is doing well and that everyone is staying safe. And I will talk to you guys on Wednesday. And in the meantime, you guys stay safe. Have a great day.